Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare
to be religious and to connect with Krishna. But at the same time, he was liberal in the way that he was teaching it. I mean, it's like something we had never seen before. You know, as in freely giving out this high knowledge.
Interesting. Okay, so you're saying that he kept the essence of what the spiritual scriptures were giving, the Vedic culture, or the ancient culture of the day, but the way in which he was teaching it was quite liberal.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
The way he was teaching it was totally liberal.
But I find that interesting because based on what Adiganga actually said there about the fact that he would still maintain these kind of like social strictures, like for example his relations to gender, which is obviously quite a pertinent topic when you look at what's going on in society right now as well. So he kind of like maintained that, which seems like a very conservative way of conveying knowledge.
Yes, that is a good point that Adiganga Maharaj is making. But at the same time, there was no other person at that time who was encouraging everyone equally to attain the highest truth, to attain the highest level of liberation, the highest level of love of God. No one else was doing that. At that time, it was very much, the Brahmin, you have to be a Brahmana to chant certain mantras. You have to be born in a Brahmin family to be able to chant certain mantras. But when Lord Chaitanya came, it was like spreading it to everyone all over India.
Okay, so we've got the idea that he gave this meditation process, this mantra meditation, to people and not just the elite that were called Brahmanas of the day. At the same time, what Adiganga poses were very strong ideas for his puritanical approach. Govinda Prabhu, you were the one actually initially said that actually you saw him predominantly as a reformatory figure. Could you give maybe examples of how he maybe pushed tradition? Or, no, not pushed tradition, sorry, rose above tradition?
Okay, I'll give you an interesting example. He met with a group known as the Tattvavadis, and he asked them what was the process to become, what was your goal and what was your process? And they said, Varnashram is our process. This is how we actually progress. And Mahaprabhu, he said, hearing and chanting is the process. And he actually kind of defeated the pride of the Tattvavadis. So this is an example where the whole Varnashram system, which is where we get the caste system from, he actually transcended it. And they actually accepted to some extent, but he said by party policy, we still follow this Varnashram system more rigidly. So there's an example of one tradition that he very much, he encouraged us to go higher, to look beyond it, see what was the purpose behind everything.
If he wanted us to look beyond, you mentioned party policy. What was his reasoning behind party policy, meaning like towing the party line. So he was pushing the boat out at the same time towing the party line.
Well, it was the Tattvavadis, they said, as a matter of party policy, this is Prabhupada's words, as in, they sort of said, you know what, you're right, but we're part of this sampradaya, and therefore we're going to carry on doing what we do. They kind of, they accepted Mahaprabhu, but they didn't change completely. So they said, as a matter of policy, we're going to carry on with what we're doing, but we recognize that you're an amazing personality, and you've given something transcendental, but we will stick with what we've got. It's kind of how the Tattvavadis looked at it. Okay,
that's a good point. Kishori, from your perspective, can you maybe give us some examples of how Chaitanya Mahaprabhu pushed? Because you know, I think of our guests here, you were the one that's kind of like saying that he embodied both. He was like giving the kind of idea of pushing tradition, but also rising above it. Could you maybe give us some examples of that?
Yeah, sure. So like Adi Ganga was saying, Lord Chaitanya was definitely a very, very strict sannyasi. That is for sure. But I remember one pastime, I believe it was in Jagannath Puri, in the temple there, and he was in the temple room, Lord Chaitanya, and one lady, one Mataji, the temple was very crowded, and she wanted to take darshan of the Lord Jagannath, and she was so eager to see Lord Jagannath that she actually climbed on the shoulders of Mahaprabhu in order to see the Lord. Now, Lord Chaitanya allowed that to happen, and this lady is glorified for that. She's glorified for that act.
And this is bearing in mind that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was, taking on a renunciate form of life, and based on what Adi Ganga said, having very strict kind of like, sort of strictures when it comes to interactions with the opposite gender and things.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like there is so many contraindications here. But this lady was glorified. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu allowed that to happen. But I think what we have to see here is what was the higher purpose behind that? Why was she doing that? It wasn't to climb on a sannyasi. It wasn't to climb on Lord Chaitanya. The reason was to see Lord Jagannath. So it's like the higher purpose kind of allowed that to happen, I guess.
Okay, interesting. So it's almost like there are strictures there. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu seems like he definitely adhered to a lot of the strictures. At the same time, there's also like a higher purpose in place where strictures, dare I say, could be adjusted.
Dare you say?
Dare I say it? Okay, fine. Adi Ganga, from your side, how do you see? I mean, obviously we've had like the reformatory view here. We've had the kind of like the nuanced, balanced view here. Obviously, you generally see Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as a traditionalist. Based on our discussion, can you maybe see any scenarios where he may have risen above tradition? And also, to back your initial point up, push tradition?
Yes, definitely. One thing that comes to mind is even as a sannyasi, he gave an audience to his mother, and you're not supposed to see any family members as a sannyasi, but he was very accommodating to her, and he allowed her to cook for him, and he accommodated her request to stay in Jagannath Puri, where she could hear news of him from the devotees who were coming and going. So that's one instance where his compassion actually overrode his traditionalism, which I think is Kishori Mataji's point. So yes, he was very traditional. There were the 64 regulative principles, the standards of Vaidhi Bhakti, and there are very kind of strict codes of practice, especially for deity worship. But actually then you think about it and you think about, well, he was traditional, but then there is the revolutionary missionary aspect, because as you go further along bhakti, then you go into Raghunaga Bhakti, spontaneous devotion. And the prevailing culture at the time, which Govinda Prabhu and you also touched on, was that, you know, it was very scholarly and knowledgeable, and to have someone there who's talking about a spontaneous relationship with Krishna, building a relationship with God, which is, you know, quite revolutionary in some aspects, and a spontaneous relationship where you don't have all the rules and regulations of, you know, fasting and chanting and all these kinds of things. And, you know, getting to God is through chanting and dancing. That's very revolutionary, and he got in trouble with that, actually, with the Jand Ghazi.
Yes, I mean, it's very interesting because you mentioned obviously some revolutionary aspects here, and yet at the same time, again, you know, it's very good. You know, we're hearing a lot of the kind of revolutionary aspects. At the same time, there are also these kind of like conservative aspects to him. Like, for example, you mentioned regulated principles. Like, you know, there are certain obligations we follow in spiritual life. And Mahaprabhu at the same time was very emphatic that as practitioners, we should be following. In fact, he had this group of disciples called the Goswamis. And he actually gave them the responsibility of delineating, right, different types of injunctions for subsequent followers down the ages to follow, right? So, again, the dichotomy still remains, but let's now move forward, because, you know, I do like the idea of obviously what you mentioned, the Kishori, about the fact that there is a kind of like the understanding that there are strictures, but then also the higher principle, and the higher principle often overrides strictures. Now, let's look at modern day presentations of Krishna consciousness and examples of how modern day, you know, sort of leaders after Chaitanya Mahaprabhu presented Krishna consciousness, and maybe even look at parallels between how you know, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu presented it and maybe other spiritual leaders. So maybe we'll go to Govinda Prabhu. How do you see, that's because we looked at, for example, from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's day, how he presented the teachings, the conservative aspects, the liberal. Let's go forward in time a bit and see how this dichotomy has still carried on.
I mean, I see parallels between Srila Prabhupada and Lord Chaitanya, in the sense that they're, in many ways, breaking with certain traditions. So, for example, we've discussed how Chaitanya broke with tradition. Srila Prabhupada, so when he came to the West, he had like ashrams where women could live, and that was, he was criticized by his godbrothers for doing such things. But at the same time, what he's doing is he's also extending mercy. So what we see is Mahaprabhu and Prabhupada, they extended mercy, and that mercy aspect, it brought them, it pushed them internally to break traditions when they weren't actually helpful for giving out the mercy. So that's how I see the sort of parallels between Prabhupada and Lord Chaitanya. And the interesting question we have now is that now that Srila Prabhupada has left the planet, are we going to carry on reviving, or is it like the revival's already been done, the things, the changes have already been made, should we change further or should we not change? And that's when it gets more interesting, because there's no one personality within our society who commands the respect of everyone. Therefore, at least you would be, well, everyone's maybe commands the respect, but not necessarily is the guru for everyone. So if different people have different opinions, how do we proceed from there? That's an interesting point.
That's a very good point. I mean, you know, in fact, this is one of the really like sort of contemporary issues that we actually deal with right now in our movement. One of the big, you know, sort of topics of discussion has recently been, for example, you mentioned about the concept of sannyasi renunciates, and it's traditionally been a male domain. And yet, traditionally, there have been some exceptions, of course. And yet, in recent times, there has been a lot of discussion on that. For example, maybe why can't women be spiritual renunciates? You look at, for example, other religious traditions, they have like female priests and so on and so forth. So there's one aspect. You know, we have these regulated principles that, you know, very sincere practitioners are, you know, kind of obligated to follow. There are four, right? Four regulated principles. Who's to say that as time goes by, should we adjust that regulated principle? Maybe make it 3, because 4 is a bit too much for people, right? It could be, but then, see, on one hand, you got Srila Prabhupada. He mentioned that, okay, you know, like you mentioned, the reformative procedure of bringing ladies into a monastery and actually practicing monastic life for their spiritual advancement. And one can argue, practically speaking, it has actually brought spiritual dividends to the movement. Like, a lot of people have been so highly benefited from it. At the same time, when it comes to principles, Prabhupada was very emphatic, no, 4 means 4. Even if people don't always follow it, still we keep the standard there. But you mentioned the point about, so where do we revive? Do we just stop reviving now? Is everything set there as a framework? Or should we have the opportunity to revive and reform like Mahaprabhu did, like Srila Prabhupada did, going into the future? But the risk is, maybe will it get too wishy-washy? Will we lose the essence? So on that note, maybe we go to Adiganga. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, I think Srila Prabhupada obviously kept to the 4 regulative principles, and his first devotees were hippies who were doing everything else. But he just said, those are the principles. And so we've kept them to this day. So should we actually change that according to time, place, and circumstance? But then there's other things. Sannyasis shouldn't marry people, but he actually married his disciples. And he was probably thinking, well, actually they should be in Grahastha ashram, so that principle is higher than the principle of sannyasis not marrying people. So he was there to make that decision because he was a pure devotee, but as Govinda Prabhu said, who's pure now to be able to think along those lines and, kind of make changes along those lines? So my answer is I don't know.
All right, fine. I mean, this will bring up more questions, I'm sure. But Kishore.
Just echoing what Govinda Prabhu said. So when Srila Prabhupada came, he allowed women to live in an ashram and to also get Brahman initiation, be on the altar, which is kind of unheard of, which is amazing because at the same time, like you mentioned, Srila Prabhupada did keep 4 very strict principles that he expects his more serious followers to follow. And that's the point I'm kind of honing in on, serious followers to follow. So the way I see it is that we should keep, this is my humble opinion, we should keep the standard where it is. Like, keep that high standard. We know what the ideal is. Now, maybe everyone can't get there, and that's fine. So we shouldn't discriminate against someone who can't right now live in that way. But I think to change that standard or to change those things that Srila Prabhupada has given would be a disaster.
Well, thank you very much. That's quite a strong statement there, Kishori. Would be a disaster. This is interesting because on one hand, what you're saying makes very good sense. There are, you mentioned there are the core principles, this ideal standard for very deep practitioners, and that's the standard we should keep. But at the same time, Krishna consciousness as a spiritual practice is still available for people to practice to whatever level they're on. I can't help also thinking that, as Govinda Prabhu mentioned, that obviously people like Mahaprabhu and Srila Prabhupada made that call to reform the standards, and do we have such people like now of that caliber? And yet at the same time, life is going on, society is moving forward, and naturally it's a spiritual tradition can't just exist independently of society. And in fact, if you look at Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Srila Prabhupada, they reformed the standards because of the social environment. So whether we like it or not, that challenge will come up, whether we have another Mahaprabhu or Srila Prabhupada in the near future or not. And that's the key. Whether we have qualified or not qualified people to make that call, can't help thinking that call needs to be made at certain points in time. Anyway, it's something to think about. I want to actually touch another point as well, that another aspect that we see in terms of the liberal conservative approach in Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's teachings is, as practitioners, our goal is obviously to connect to Krishna. That is like the prime focus of any sincere practitioner of Krishna consciousness. Now the question is engagement with the world, right? There is definitely a direction that is given by certain sections of devotees that we should, just focus on Krishna consciousness, focus on connecting with Krishna, not really get into too much what's going on in terms of social issues, political issues, the current kind of movements of the day, and really almost like create like a spiritual bubble around us and just go back to Krishna. There's also another section that would say, actually no, let's be inclusive. Let's practice Krishna conscious, but let's really get into people's business and try and help them, right? Let's really help them. So one of the things, like service to God, service to humanity, right? What are we? Are we here to be philanthropic and really help people? Or are we here to just really just focus ourselves on just going back to Krishna and not so much worry about what's going around the society? Interesting here, because we have examples of both, right? As Krishna conscious movement, we've got food distribution for the homeless, Adi Ganga. You help with the school, right? We've got Krishna conscious schools. We've got Krishna conscious hospitals. These come across rather philanthropic, right? What's our stance? Govind Prabhu, your view. Service to God, service to man. Are we here to be altruistic or leave all that side and just focus on Krishna?
Well, here's an interesting dilemma, I think. My personal experience is, if you actually touch